everyone, welcome to Zonin Canada. This is your host, Jesse Betteridge. So even though most of the people who have been demanding anime content or subversive animation content on Canadian TV, or for that matter on Canadian streaming services, are explicitly looking for content that's targeted at adults, that whole industry and culture has been, for better or worse, kind of inextricably tied to the world of youth and children's broadcasting in Canada. And, you know, this whole area of Canadian media sort of operates in a kind of special way, and this has bred endless amounts of speculation and rumors about how all these things work behind the scenes. This episode, I'm talking to a guest who I'm hoping can clarify a lot of these issues and put a lot of the rumors and misconceptions that have been flying around for years to rest. He's had a long career working at YTV, Teletoon and DHX Media. He also currently runs a blog called Scenes from the Couch, which can be found at scenesfromthecouch.com. His name is John Rooney. Thanks a lot for coming on the show, John.
Thank you, Jesse.
So, between YTV, Teletoon, and DHX, you've pretty much worked the full gamut of sort of children's media in Canada.
Yeah, I have. I've been at all three of the networks. My time at DHX, I should clarify, was just as a consultant, though. I wasn't a full-time employee or anything.
To be fair, it's not much of a gamut, though. So, can you sort of give us a little bit of background at what you did at what your jobs were at each of these companies and how long you worked there?
So I've been in this industry for over 20 some odd years now, and I've worked in working kids television for over 16, 17 of those 20 years. I started out at YTV as a program coordinator and worked my way up to director of programming. And so basically I was in charge of the planning and scheduling of the network, of what shows we would air, and helped with acquiring the programming and content that worked for YTV.
So this would have been mainly around the late 90s kind of.
I started at YTV in 1997 and became director of programming probably about 2005, but I been always in the programming department.
Okay.
And then after that, I moved over to Teletoon, where I had the same title, but my functions were a bit more on the strategy side, as well as acquiring content for the network. And during that time at both networks, I helped launch Nickelodeon Canada, Cartoon Network Canada, Adult Swim Canada, and before I had left, YTV was starting to work on ABC Spark.
Right, and because ABC Spark is also sort of grouped in with that youth programming, which is I know it's like Adult Swim Canada and Teletoon at Night. It's sort of grouped under that millennials brand,
yes,
which
exactly.
From what I can tell is not really its own thing. It's more. It actually is, like, Corus Millennials actually is Corus Kids. It's just going by a different name.
From when I was there, yes.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Sort of this older-oriented content is still kind of, in some ways, joined at the hip with kids' TVs, at least as far as things go with Teletoon and Corus. As a result, a lot of the services that, you know, sort of give that millennial-oriented or even older skewing content as far as animation goes, are sort of entrenched in that world of youth broadcasting. So having worked for so long in, you know, kids and youth television, what would you say is different from that part of the industry versus working with television for broader audiences?
I've always been a believer there hasn't been that much of a difference. Mm-hmm. I just think that one of the things probably on the kids side of the business is that there's a lot more repeats and a lot more evergreen content. So shows from 10, 20 years ago can still work and play, and new kids of today will discover them and watch them, as opposed to, say, on the primetime side, where you're less likely to find a new audience for, reruns of MASH or some of the older stuff. But in terms of how we worked in terms of the scheduling planning side, there wasn't that much difference. We took into account ratings. We took into account our audience. We took into account of what they wanted to see. I think there's a lot of things that we did on the kids side that sort of closed some gaps down the road as we sort of got into more niche content. For example, ABC's Friday night TGIF with Boy Meets World and all that stuff. When that went away, the kids networks kind of took that content on. because it was a big hit with our audience. That's the live action comedies.
Yeah, right. That was always kind of an exception when it comes to American primetime.
Yes.
And thus Canadian primetime
yes.
content.
We sort of were able to be that home for family programming down the road. So we sort of the kids market sort of transitioned from we are just super serving a 8 to 12-year-old boy or girl, and that's it, and that's where we're going to be for nearly 24 hours of the day. And we sort of graduated into more of a family structure because we saw that the family viewing and family programming was it was filling in that niche that was sort of going away from the older networks.
We've seen that metamorphosis sort of across the continent with just look at how the face of YTV and to a similar extent Family Channel has been since mid 2000s. We've seen a shift away from like various youth demographics to more of a generalized live action driven sort of comedy, sometimes dramedy kind of format that I guess Disney has really been the template for, and Nick as well.
Yeah.
So you worked with the launch of Nickelodeon Canada, Cartoon Network Canada, and Adult Swim Canada, those brands. So of course, working with Nick while you were at Corus initially, I take it, and then CNNAS when you were at Teletoon. Do you have anything interesting to say about what went behind acquiring those brands and launching them? Because it seems that the current strategies with not only youth content, I guess adult content in general, seems to be just nailing down these American brands and just presenting them with a presence on Canadian TV, not always necessarily doing something with the presence, as I guess we can probably assess with the way Nickelodeon Canada is right now. Is there anything you can say about the different challenges or different motivations behind launching those brands in Canada?
I think one of the things about launching those brands in Canada was that, basically the channels Teletoon and YTV were always kind of the home of those brands anyway.
Yeah.
The Cartoon Networks and the Nickelodeon programming. And I think for us, what we wanted to do was just sort of make sure that those that we were treating those, we sort of locked down those brands and to find content on there and sort of expand what we wanted to do, because we had so much content coming out of both those brands, and again, these are at separate times when I worked with them, that there was no way we could air all of what was coming out on the network. So we basically had to launch a separate network to sort of handle some of the overflow. Otherwise, there's going to be content that was going to be left on the shelf and could either be picked up by somebody else, which would be great for us if we wanted to still be exclusive with these brands, or that, couldn't be seen here, and who knows what was happening in the future. And I think when both networks sort of put down and said we're going to invest in this and bring these brands here and represent them, it was seeing the future of this whole, at the time, digital uprising of all these different new networks and wanting to be a part of that.
So the funny thing with Cartoon Network and Adult Swim specifically is that it seems that with animation, and specifically with a lot of the stuff coming from both of those networks, I always got the feeling that Teletoon and YTV also sort of dragged behind when it came to bringing a lot of that content over on both sides. And it's funny because, as we kind of discussed in our last episode too, producing animation is one of the things that the Canadian television industry actually seems to be doing a kind of okay job with. But a result of that always seems to be that there always seem to be more barriers to bringing a lot of American content in. Because, if you could say one thing about the Canadian television industry or the Canadian broadcast industry, it's that it really excels at importing American content. But animation was always kind of an exception to that. I don't know. Do you think that that Teletoon's ability to produce content has sort of impeded its ability to import it as well?
I think there's a couple of things in there. I think they're separate things, though. I don't think one, the ability for us to make our own content didn't mean that therefore we weren't going to import American content.
Right.
I think there are just a lot of factors in there. I think from a global perspective, we are so close to the United States, more so than any other country in the world, that with the media of the U.S. just infiltrating in Canada just because of border stations or what have you. And remember, this is a time before when the internet was even that popular, but yet we still had that U.S. influence.
Yeah.
From a consumer perspective, a viewer perspective in Canada, we sort of gloss over our own stuff and just want the next big hits from the U.S. And it's always sort of been that way. And even now, it's probably worse because it's not even just the U.S. We want the big hits from around the world all at the same time. I think the thing for us, why sometimes the Canadian networks at the time were, as you say, behind importing the U.S. stuff, or why we got it late. There's a number of factors in there. I think one is, again, just not enough space on the network to handle all that content. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the reasons why newer channels and newer things were sort of created to sort of help us with that. I think another thing you have to remember is that from a sales point of view from the U.S. side, we are still considered an international country, and therefore sometimes we are under international guidelines. Remember, this is still the mid-2000s, late 2000s we're talking about, so the concept of day and date as it pertains to the primetime world didn't really factor in on the kids' side because there was no chance of torrenting as you would have now. Latest episodes of things.
Or at the very least, the audience that did was largely irrelevant in a commercial sense.
Yeah, I mean, they were minor.
Yeah.
And then again, when you're talking about your average kid, and again, we're not talking about the Adult Swim or older content, but we're talking about your average kid. They weren't, they weren't necessarily knowing that this was delayed, that this was their first time seeing it. And didn't think that this had already aired in the States, unless they went down and visited their friends or cousins in the States or were down on that channel. So it didn't. We were able to program to what the channel's needs were for the audience that we were building up.
So when Cartoon Network Canada was launched, I know you were only at Teletoon for a couple of years. I mean, where was that sort of? Where were they at with that process when you first joined?
When I started, they were fairly down the road, mm-hmm. and I think within like 3 to 5 months, we had launched by the time I started. So, I mean, in terms of their plans and what they wanted to do, they were already pretty much set in stone. It was just my job to sort of help facilitate it and come up with what would be the strategy for it at the beginning and why we aired the things we aired. One of the things we wanted to do was we wanted to, as much as we could with the license that we had for it, was to mirror the U.S. as much as possible.
The Cartoon Network side, of course.
Cartoon Network side.
Yeah.
So when they had a new episode, we would try to air it at the same time. And again with logistics of delivery and stuff like that, since that didn't happen, we wanted to program things on the same nights. We wanted to do the same events, but only if the events kind of made sense. So obviously, if they had something big on their Thanksgiving, well, in Canada, that's not a holiday up here. So could only take advantage of what we could when we could. And I think we were very successful upon launch. I don't remember the exact numbers, but we were able to sort of give that experience because we were able to utilize their promo strategy, their bumpers, and they were able to give us a lot of content to sort of give it that experience.
Yeah, when you watch Cartoon Network now, it's not exactly like what you see in the U.S., but it's so close that you really it really sort of achieves that mirroring effect. Of course, I want to get to some Adult Swim questions, but before I jump to that, I was just curious, when this whole process was going through, was there any concern at Teletoon that launching a Cartoon Network Canada would dilute their own brand? Because Teletoon, I would say, is one of the more successful brands we've seen on Canadian specialty TV overall. Now we're in this situation now where Corus owns. I don't know what's going on there. I don't think anyone knows what's going on there now, but it seems like they don't really know what to do with Teletoon anymore. It's always changing format, and I guess with some fans, there's a bit of a fear that they might just wind up dumping that service, at least in English. And I'm just curious what the thinking towards that kind of scenario was at the time when they were first acquiring that, or were they not, or was it not a big concern?
Well, you also have to remember that they also owned half of Teletoon.
Yeah.
For the longest time, so we were always part of Corus.
Yeah, oh, right. Yep.
Part of Astral. Yeah. So we had we did talk to them. We weren't totally out of the loop on what they were kind of doing. But I think the decision at the time was, they saw what was happening with YTV and Nickelodeon and saw how the launching of Nickelodeon Canada didn't really dilute YTV's brand. And again, the fact of the matter was, based on the content needs of Teletoon and how much original content had to be promoted and done, and there was always content from Cartoon Network, it was just made sense to sort of put it up there. We did our best to sort of promote the difference between Cartoon Network and Teletoon. Is that in Teletoon we were really amping up the funny, that we were the comedy part, and we tried not to put a lot of what I would say action programming on, except for our Friday night block when I started there, and we sort of made sure that Cartoon Network Canada had a bit more of that on the weekend.
Right.
So
because I believe Young Justice was running on Cartoon Network.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, so there were a couple of things like that. We were also lucky that we had a lot of the Marvel superhero content, so we're able to say, okay, well, Cartoon Network's DC and we were Marvel on Teletoon, and try not to have the two overlap as much. But at the same point, I've always thought that Teletoon itself, and even when talking, and even the people who are there from Teletoon now would always say that Teletoon was always slightly younger than Cartoon Network in a sense. Sure, they had 16 and Total Drama and stuff like that, but they still were the home of Scooby-Doo. And Scooby-Doo is generally a younger program, even from when I was at YTV and we were looking at things at their schedule, that it was always a younger show and it was always younger than YTV. Mm-hmm. So I think that Teletoon has always maintained that we are the funny, wacky, fun channel, and then Cartoon Network was just for a slightly older, maybe more of a 10-year-old boy. I mean, yeah, you're splitting hairs at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But this is kind of where we live in this niche market. I always think it's funny when I read comments from people who post to space or sci-fi, and then they show something that no one thinks is space, or that shouldn't belong on here. And I'm like a mystery program or something. I can't even think of anything as an example. And I'm like, well, that's not a space show. And I'm like, wow, you really are splitting hairs.
Well, I mean, the market, when you're looking at the kids stuff, the market is so diluted now with so many different services from Corus and from DHX. They have their 3 services. And then, of course, you have Knowledge Network with BBC Kids as well, just rounding it off. I mean, do you think that's sustainable? or do you think something's going to give at some point with these services?
Only time will tell. I mean, I think the thing is that we are 1/10 of the United States population, yet we want to have all the same channels that are available in the United States.
And then not to mention all the streaming services that this spills over into as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we have the same amount of kids channels as they do in the United States. So it's hard to tell whether it's going to be diluted up here and we're just sort of splitting hairs. I think Corus has put themselves in a very interesting and unique position that the majority of kids content is filtered out there. So, from their point of view, ratings and ad sales probably are now a bit more centralized. So it's a little bit easier for them in the sense of looking at the competition, because their competition is pretty much themselves. And then from the DHX side, because Family Channel doesn't carry ads, and Charge is the only one that does. I mean, that's not even a factor, really.
Yeah, they hardly show any ads from what I've seen.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've followed. I've been watching that Iron Man anime that they've been airing on Family Charge, and it's unusual. They run it on Saturday mornings, and they don't censor it and anything. And not that it has anything that's too visually offensive or anything, but they it runs with a C8 rating. There's a little bit of light swearing in it and stuff, but they just throw it on there. And then during the ad breaks, there's going to be I counted 2 ads that ran during the entire show. So that I don't really know how big of an audience that service is reaching. I guess it takes a couple of years to build an audience base for ad sales like that.
Yeah, and then for them, I mean, they're DHX is such an interesting case now because they practically have had to reinvent themselves in the past year. When Corus acquired all the Disney content, you're left with a network that heavily relied on U.S. acquired content, not just U.S. And really, they were able to hone their original programming to just complement their service. to fill in the missing pieces, so to speak. So rather than, we create 10 new series a year on their own, they only had to do like one or two, and now they're finding that they have to acquire a lot more and create a lot more. So it's put them in a unique position to sort of figure out, well, how do they differentiate themselves in the market, that as well as sustain themselves as original content. And I think they're actually doing a really good job. I like what they're trying, at least.
They're certainly firing at all cylinders when it comes to producing original content right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're doing things very differently than what you're seeing on the other kids networks around the world, as far as I'm concerned. I think the closest is probably BBC Kids, aligning themselves with some of the things that are working from a streaming model. The deal they have with Awesomeness TV is a really good one, and Degrassi, it sort of helps put them on the map a bit more.
Yeah, it's as we also mentioned in the last episode, they made a really unfortunate deal with Degrassi with Netflix, though, because Netflix released all the episodes in every country but Canada before those episodes actually aired here, which they really should have signed the contract so that it was the other way around.
Yeah, I'm not privy to how that all worked out, but
yeah.
I think the fact of the matter, I think the main thing is that one of the true original Canadian programs still originates from a Canadian-owned network and a Canadian-owned company, which is the main thing.
Yeah. So going back to Cartoon Network and Adult Swim, so of course you have the situation where Cartoon Network had a deal mapped out where they were essentially mirroring the U.S. network and were premiering as much content simultaneously as possible. Do you have any idea why no deal like that seemed to materialize with the Adult Swim side of things?
I don't know why. I'm not sure how that worked on the Adult Swim side.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember that the Tech TV.
G4 Tech TV had
Tech TV had a deal for a lot of that content.
Yeah.
And I believe that, even though the CRTC sort of slapped their hand a bit and said that's a violation of your license for airing that, they still had a contract with Adult Swim for that content. And I think there was a bit of a gray area as to why it can't be imported over.
Yeah, they originally had their license changed so that they could run anime, and then when their deal with Geneon, when Geneon died, that deal died along with Geneon, and they were never able to strike up a good enough deal with anyone else, so they just sort of went looking at other content. I know they ran the IT Crowd for a little while, and then they finally started bringing the Adult Swim stuff over because it seemed after a certain point that Teletoon wasn't really interested in it, or they weren't bringing it over like they had for a few years around the mid 2000s.
I also didn't think that, to be fair and honest, that Teletoon at Night needed it, because the home of Family Guy and Futurama and Robot Chicken, they had a pretty good run. That having all that extra newer, I'm going to say newer because, Teletoon at Night did run Harvey Birdman and a bunch of other stuff from the earlier days.
Yeah.
And Aqua Teen Hunger Force, I think.
Well, you could certainly say they didn't have any reason to have to fight for it.
No, and they could cherry pick what they wanted.
Yeah.
So they probably took a lot of the best stuff. I wasn't there at the time when all that was happening. But I think I think there was a bit of confusion on that part, and then I think for Teletoon's priorities at the time, maybe because of that, but they're going to focus on the kids and not so much worry about the Adult Swim play as much, because it's still a niche audience, and their goal has always been kids first, Teletoon at Night second in a way.
And
which is the problem when you have two distinct audiences sharing one dial.
I was gonna mention as well, Teletoon has always had this very difficult balancing act when it comes to because they're not technically a children's broadcaster. They are an all audiences broadcaster that runs children's content during the day and adult content at night. And I know they've run into some trouble trying to keep that balance before, which is why Teletoon at Night has that ridiculously long disclaimer that runs right now.
Yeah. And I think the thing that's different is that, at least from my understanding in the U.S., even though Cartoon Network and Adult Swim share the same channel number, you still go to whatever it is, 236, let's just say.
Yeah.
You know, from all intents and purposes, how it's run is as two distinct channels.
They are.
That this one shuts down, and then this one starts up at like 10 p.m. or something.
It's actually the idea that Adult Swim is a block in the U.S. is a huge misconception. They are, in fact, two separate networks.
They are two separate networks with two separate teams that sort of run that run them. They have distinct identities and purposes. And from even their Nielsen rating standpoints, they are considered two separate networks, which up here is a lot harder to do.
Yeah.
But even in the U.S., like when we had meetings with them with Cartoon Network, or we talked to them, they still had parents going, you know, complaining about Adult Swim.
Oh, of course.
We're a kid channel. And you still couldn't get the little icon to change over from Cartoon Network to Adult Swim when you're scrolling down.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it has to be one or the other, and of course they're gonna make the station ID that shows up on your digital guide Cartoon Network.
But aside from that, they've done a great job of distinguishing between the two brands. That there is no crossover between those two. Whereas up here, it's probably a little harder, or was a little harder.
That's one of the notable things that you're going to notice most often, I find, is that you'll find ad spillover between the two. I know one of the most frequent complaints you see about Teletoon is that sometimes when the adult ads spill over into the children's programming, especially for things like call-in dating services or sex lines or whatever show up during that seems to be a really common problem for some reason. I don't understand why it's always those ads that seem to show up during the children's programming. And then conversely, and this is the thing that I am still really noticing with Adult Swim Canada, is that it seems that when I watch Adult Swim Canada, like I think they're starting to pick up more adult advertisers, but it seems that about half the ads that run are children's ads. And like I get the impression that the reason is because the audience is small and they can't sell enough, or they can't make enough sales to adult advertisers to fill out the entire time.
I mean, that would be my guess too.
Yeah.
And wherever probably advertisers just buying in bulk or something, and so they have to fill the time somehow, and they still have to run the ads. So sometimes you're going to get those kids ads in adult time, and sometimes you're going to get adult ads in kids programming that's at like 2 or 3 in the morning.
Yeah.
But it's 2 and 3 in the morning where kids should be up watching it. I know that with time shifting, that's also caused a lot of concern, that if someone on the West Coast can watch a show that airs at 10 p.m. here at 7 p.m. over there, they have time shifting, you know, parents are like, but you should be airing kids programming even though it's Adult Swim. So
it's difficult to get different providers to fall into line with that all the time. In fact, Shaw just only now just started putting Cartoon Network Canada on the West feed.
Okay.
So I was getting Adult Swim Canada at 6 p.m. Up until this point. Actually, originally this episode was going to be kind of a moratorium for the Teletoon at Night block, because it was originally set to end back in March. Teletoon apparently made a last-minute decision to not do that. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I think it's very notable that Teletoon is actually one of the first networks in the world that actually tried to do that dual juggling act between children's programming in the daytime and adult programming at night. From the very point that they launched, they were doing that a good 2 to 3 years before the idea of something like Adult Swim on Cartoon Network was even thinkable. And it's funny that there's still so many problems with that, despite the fact that they've had so much time to work on that. But I guess we have so many factors like advertising and parental complaints and what package the cable and satellite providers sort you into. It can be challenging. Going back to Adult Swim Canada, though, so I know that there was a lot of confusion with G4 had their deal in place, but I mean, why would they license the brand though if they couldn't get the content? I still have a hard time wrapping my head around that, and it seems like they're starting to make efforts now, but they just can't pick up the slack for some reason.
I would just assume that maybe they probably had to, as part of getting the content, that they said that they would do it and hope to sweeten the deal. And said, well, I don't think they could have done one without the other, even though they are two separate networks in the U.S. I think this is probably an easier way of trying to get a lock on some of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then hopefully it would all kind of sort itself out down the road. And hopefully we're seeing, we say sort itself down the road and we think, oh, it'll be a couple of months, but then, with lawyers and paperwork, it probably takes a little longer than that. So as you said yourself, we're starting to see a little bit of that now. I think we'll probably and I don't know where this all sits on the radar of the whole new Corus Shaw merger, because they've probably got a lot of bigger fish to fry, but, hopefully there's a bit more clout that could help them push some of that content sooner. I think they've done, but I do have to say that, at the beginning stages when we were programming and planning Adult Swim and looking at the content, I mean, we had a lot of the back catalog which we utilized. We were able to use, some of the Fox programming we got, which was, Family Guy and Futurama.
We had King of the Hill, but that's gone now.
Yeah, we had King of the Hill. Sorry, not Futurama. I meant, King of the Hill and Family Guy. And then we were also able to use some of the things that hadn't been seen, like Tim and Eric. So I remember that was one of the earlier ones that we ended up putting in as well.
Yeah.
And then we're able to sort of bring back some of the ones that we thought were really good. And then, after I had left, they ended up doing a couple of deals with the Fox Animation Destination, because they ended up getting Axe Cop and a bunch of other stuff from them. So
interestingly, that stuff is all off the schedule now.
Well,
yeah,
I don't know how well it did.
I think they were running Axe Cop on weeknights on Teletoon for a while, so yeah. I'm going to assume that probably did well. I don't think the rest of the stuff did.
Yeah, but the point is, at least that they weren't just leaving the service to, leaving the service on the shelf to say, it doesn't matter, we got all this other stuff that we don't have to worry about that. They were still trying to find ways to make that work while they were sorting out whatever was going on. And now they picked up Rick and Morty, which is a good sign that, hopefully we'll start to see, I'm hoping we'll start to see news, news readers, because not much, but I'm hoping we'll start to see some of the newer stuff that Adult Swim's known for.
Well, they have Samurai Jack is supposed to be coming in the fall. Considering that they run the reruns on the block, I really hope that they aim for, if not day and date premieres, and very, very close premieres.
Yeah.
Of course, if they're saving up for something like simultaneous Rick and Morty premieres, that would probably be the best thing they could do. In fact, if they can't pull that off, I have to really question what the point of keeping this going is, especially with the app, which is a really interesting situation because, as far as I know, Corus doesn't have anything to do with that. It's run entirely out of the U.S. side of things with Adult Swim. I mean, you've mentioned some of the contractual problems that probably resulted in the weird situation Adult Swim Canada's in. I mean, is there anything else that you feel has prevented Adult Swim content from getting traction and whatever is necessary in Canada and maybe other countries too? It really seems like Adult Swim content just has a hard time gaining traction outside of the US for some reason. Like in the UK, for instance, they're on, I think, their fourth iteration of Adult Swim. It's been jumping from network to network for over a decade now.
I don't think that's an Adult Swim issue. I think that is what I'm going to call primetime animation issue.
How would you explain that particular issue?
That programming, that style, that type of niche programming is just a really hard sell outside of North America.
For audiences or advertisers?
Everyone. Because it is so, just the style of it and the humor of it is just so North American. An analogy to this is something like a show like 30 Rock, which is so U.S. centric with the sketch show and the behind the scenes. Like, when it debuted in Germany, I think it got like a 0 rating because German audiences just couldn't relate to this. And I think that is the issue with a lot of this content. And I think there's only a few that break out of that mold. And the ones that break out of that mold tend to be, if they were live action, just a normal everyday sitcom. So Simpsons, Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, to some extent Futurama, I don't think King of the Hill went, and possibly King of the Hill. I mean, all of those 5 shows, they center around a family. They center around things that are easily translatable to an audience that's foreign, and are on a broader comedic scope. But I think when you look at something like a Robot Chicken, it's a lot harder to get that humor to translate to people outside of North America because it's very North American centric. So I don't. So from an international standpoint, I mean, because and I say that because in my role now, what I'm doing is a lot of consulting and doing a lot of working with producers and pitching shows out there and creating own shows. The primetime animation scene is probably the hardest one to do because not a lot of people can sell that outside, and so not a lot of people want to take that on, which is why going towards the internet or YouTube, for that example, for that type of animation has made that work a lot better than going to a regular traditional broadcaster.
It is funny you mention that because many of those programs do wind up getting dubbed in French for the French Teletoon or Teletoon la Nuit, which interestingly from some, it seems to be one of the most highly regarded millennial-focused brands in Quebec right now, whereas I'm not sure if Teletoon at Night and Adult Swim Canada have gained anywhere near as much traction.
I think you also got to understand Teletoon la Nuit, and from my brief time working with it, and as someone who doesn't speak French, one of the things that Teletoon did, which was, excellent, was that they put forth the money to create Quebec French-only dubs of The Simpsons, of Family Guy, so that the Quebec audiences actually heard them in what can be just, in Quebec French.
I think they do Robot Chicken, too.
And Robot Chicken, yes. And they've made stars out of the voice actors there. Like, they're regarded as celebrities. So that was something that, that was done before I got there. And it was, I think, a really smart move. Because the French, and this is only my small learning of it, is that, could import just the French version of The Simpsons that, Fox does for international audiences. And that's fine. But we were able to tailor it to a specific audiences, so we had specific language and specific gags, mostly on the language to use the Quebec idiom, which is why Simpsons, I was told when I first started there, the schedule is like, don't touch the Simpsons on Teletoon la Nuit. Just leave it where it is, don't move it, don't do anything with it, and anything you had to do, you had to build around it. We also had specific Teletoon la Nuit programs that, we couldn't translate back into English that did huge over there. Tete Claque, that's the closest I'll get to speaking French in this podcast, which is a huge, huge phenomenon in Quebec. And when we did our own animated version of it, did really, really great ratings. But it wasn't something that we were prepared to translate and bring into the English side because it was really tailored to Quebec.
Well, they did now. There is the English version, Knuckleheads.
They are trying an English version.
Oh yeah, it's actually running weeknights. They were running it on Adult Swim Canada for a while. Now it's running on weeknights on Teletoon starting next month. It's called Knuckleheads in English.
Oh, that's Knuckleheads. Okay, yeah.
It's pretty. I think it's, from what I've seen, I think it's really bad. And I can tell it's very mean-spirited humor, which I get with a lot of Quebec things sometimes, or at least the animated stuff. I'm sure there's some stuff that's lost in translation, but I found that it was a pretty inadequate final product in English. Same goes with the Les Grands Gueules, which became Two Nuts and a Richard. They still seem to be going that route with some of their other stuff. If you've been to the Adult Swim Canada website, they have a new pilot up for a show called Inspector Bronco. It is a French production, but it's kind of like an Archer knockoff. So I think they're starting to move away from emulating Family Guy and towards emulating Archer, which I don't think is a problem because I take it Archer has been very successful on Teletoon since they're doing the simultaneous premieres of that now.
Archer was huge when I was there, and so I wouldn't be surprised if it's the #1 show. I have no ratings to back that up.
They said in the latest press release, I think, that it was one of the top, I think the top show on Teletoon at night.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Inspector Bronco is interesting because it's a French production. It's based off of these series of these live action web shorts that were in Quebec Productions, made with a Quebec staff, starring the creator in brownface, playing this inspector in India. The animated version seems to be a significant step up from that in a few ways. They actually got the Montreal-based comedian Sugar Sammy to play the main character in both French and English, which was a very good move because he really sells it. It's just too bad. I think he actually moved to Paris recently, which may have been after this was recorded. So if it does turn into a full-time series, that would be disappointing if they don't get him back. I found it was quite good. I encourage you, if you're in Canada, to check out that pilot on their website and give them some feedback. Did you have a chance to watch that at all?
I know you sent it. I haven't. Sorry, I haven't really had to sit down and catching up on a bunch of other back TV that I've been missing.
Of course.
So no, but I mean, from what you say, that I like this. Like you said, Sugar Sammy's a good catch. Even though he moved to Paris, it wouldn't take much to sort of get him to do his gig for voicing over English and French if it does continue to go into a full-time series.
Yeah. So just in terms of getting like this subversive content on the air, I mean, I know you mentioned that it's a sort of a North American thing. So do you think that do you feel there are any kind of barriers towards getting it into like the Canadian system, or is subversive content not really a problem for Canada? It's just some specific finicky issues with the Adult Swim stuff.
No, from a Canadian perspective, no. We like I said, we're so close to the U.S. that we kind of share the same sensibilities when it comes to a lot of that humor. I would actually say that Canadians are probably even more subversive than the U.S. Just from my own, viewing habits and experiences and stuff like that. Sometimes I feel the U.S. is just a bit tame. There was a story that, with Detention Air, that the reason why it hasn't been picked up in Canada was they thought one of the characters was, I think, too mean-spirited or something like that. And you're like, really? Oh, okay. So again, it's, I'm not going to say we can handle that stuff, but I think that's sort of a bit in our sensibility that we like some of that stuff. It's just more from an international sort of point of view that it's a little bit harder to translate. And then when you think of the business aspect, which is, you put a lot of money into creating these programs and shows, you want to recoup that by selling out to as many people as possible. If you can only sell them to one other country, how do you recoup your costs for making it if you can't sell it abroad? So that's why there's a little bit of a gun shy attitude in Canada towards making more original content that way. In terms of getting the content from Adult Swim Canada up here and having it air on Adult Swim Canada, I think we just, from what I've seen in the schedule and how they're progressing, I think eventually we will be at that point that we'll be day and day with all that stuff. So that's my prediction anyway.
Yeah, I hope. I love the app, but I hope it doesn't rob us of having like a kind of a proper Adult Swim station, because it loses something when you're just kind of watching things on demand and you don't get the sort of broadcast flow experience with that type of content. It really helps it a lot.
Well, and that's one of the things, like from Adult Swim in general, from a broadcaster point of view, I think that's one of the things that makes that channel a bit more unique than any other channel, is that people watch the things in between the programs, whether it's the fake commercials or the bumps or the greatest event in television ever and all that type of stuff. Adult Swim goes out of their way to make sure that every minute that is shown in there is captivating and can be watched, as much as that there are ads and stuff like that. So
that's the problem with trying to import the Adult Swim brand, is that even just bringing all that stuff and reassembling it and trying to recreate that is it really seems beyond the scope of what like the team behind Adult Swim Canada can do with their like obvious budget limitations right now.
I should say that before the whole takeover, when we were at Teletoon, the group behind the promos of Adult Swim Canada, they were able to mirror that stuff to a T, and were able to make Canadian specific type ones, which were funny. And again, I don't know if that's still happening now.
It's definitely. I wasn't able to really watch it at that time because I'm on Shaw, and the channel was not available on Shaw. I know that there were some bumps that were running, and there are still occasionally bumps that come up, but the network definitely feels empty now. Yeah.
Okay. But at the time at Teletoon, we were very conscious about trying to make sure that we had Canadian flavor type of those things, and we used a lot of the stuff that they sent us as well. Because again, our goal was to make this as much as possible with what we had mirror what was happening in the U.S., because that's the only reason why you would tune into the channel up here.
Also in regards to Teletoon and Adult Swim Canada, so there's been a conception for many years that Teletoon doesn't want to deal with anime targeted an adult audience. Do you have anything to say to that belief?
Hey.
I mean, they do seem oddly resistant to it.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
I think there is resistance to it in general. It's and there always has been. Like, remember when I was at YTV and we were doing Bionix and we were airing Inuyasha, Naruto, and all that stuff. They firmly were, anti that side. And I don't know whether that was a competitive sort of thing, like, well, we'll just let them take care of it rather than try to compete. We'll do our own thing, which is smart. But now that is kind of gone the way, the opportunity for them to sort of take that on, and they haven't. I think for them the comedy is such a big deal, because it's universal and broad, that something so niche. So even the subversive comedy niche is still more is still broader than something else that's from an anime perspective. For them, that they're not sure about it.
It's just funny when you go on their social media, they're always just being like bombarded very, very prominently about bringing Toonami on Adult Swim Canada or to put something on Teletoon. And obviously, people yelling things online doesn't translate into ratings. But I mean, I think when there's that much visible demand, I mean, it seems weird that you wouldn't just give something a chance.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, it's and that is part of the Adult Swim experience in the U.S. for sure. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why they are resistant to it now, and I don't think they should be. And I totally agree with you. I think it would bring a new audience to it, probably bump up the subscribers, hopefully.
That's another thing with Pick and Pay coming. I mean, do you think that niche content could play a role in whether stations are able to sink or swim? I know it's a little hard to say at this point, but
I also think the age of the audience probably has a bigger play whether Pick or Pay works and in the anime audience. And I think that, with Netflix providing a lot of content that way, and with, Crunchyroll up here and a couple of other services, I think the question is, do they need to do that? How much of a differentiating point would it be for them when it's available in other things, and is it truly the best of the bunch? And I don't know how to answer that.
Well, I would say that, between all the services you named, I mean, they all serve different audiences when it comes to delivering anime. You look at the Toonami audience, you look at the audience that watches stuff on Netflix, and the audience that watches stuff on Crunchyroll. They're all different, and maybe you could argue that you can't fragment it that much in Canada, but I mean, there definitely is the audience, because when Netflix licenses anime, they wait until the show is completely done, and then they will launch the whole thing at once, dubbed in 5 languages, which, me personally, I guess I would say I'm a Crunchyroll person who likes to watch things every week as they air in Japan. I find that infuriating, but then you have, like, the casual Netflix audiences who don't follow things to a T like, the hardcore fans like me and most of the people on this show do, and will just like to stumble into something like that on Netflix. I think the Toonami audience is very similar in the US as well. Until Toonami relaunched the US a few years ago, I was of the opinion that it's not necessary to have anime on TV anymore, but I think that it has really shown that the audience is very diverse and reacts to different modes of delivery in different ways.
And I think the weird thing, to speak a bit more generally about anime, is that I think broadcast executives in North America, and I'm going to take Netflix out of this because I know that they have a dedicated team who is really ingrained in anime, but in general, broadcast executives in general look to anime more as a genre than as a genre within a genre, because within anime there is sci-fi, there's fantasy, there's comedy, there's all these different things, and it's not just one thing. Hopefully I'm not speaking on term, but it's a style more than anything of a way of telling a show.
It's certainly a medium, I think it's safe to say, yeah.
So for broadcast execs up here, it's like, this is still, I hate to say it, but it's still such a thing that they don't know how to program it, because you go back to what a kids network is, because they're tied together generally, is kid networks still don't program like a serialized thing. You just air a new SpongeBob on Fridays, and it's usually self-contained, and it doesn't follow the other ones. And it's only recently that we're starting to see them branch out a little bit of a serialized nature. So I think for them it's a little bit harder to program. I mean,
I even remember back in the 90s when YTV was running that old 90s Spider-Man cartoon. They were for a while they were actually not like, I think for the latest season they actually ran every other episode every week for some reason. That was I remember that being incredibly bizarre and hard to follow.
I'm not taking any responsibility for that.
I wasn't blaming you. And of course we all remember the Gundam Wing debacle when they aired.
But you bring up a good point about the whole Gundam Wing thing, because I was there for that.
Oh, well, yeah.
And it was basically, one of my earliest jobs was to screen Gundam Wing and Endless Waltz, and I watched it, and I sort of went and I said, I think this follows the end of it. This shouldn't be kicking off the series, but no other things prevailed, because I think we were misinformed, or we were told that this was the sort of the launch of the whole thing. And so you take what information, and especially then when it was early ages and we were kind of all new to this, you take the information that you're given and do your best to sort of try and work with it.
Well, while we're talking about sort of that Gundam Wing era when YTV was definitely more diverse kind of network than it is now. So, like, do you remember what the reaction is to Gundam Wing? Or, I mean, what the reaction was to Endless Waltz when that aired? Because I remember being very surprised when it aired uncut on the network. I'm not sure if you remember anything about that.
I don't think we had any real negative reaction other than you're airing it out of order.
Yeah, that definitely would have probably...
I think it flew under the radar of people who wouldn't normally get upset. And I don't think we aired it at like a really early time.
I think that, by the time the violent stuff happened, it was pretty much past watershed, but yeah.
So I don't think we got into that much of an issue with it in terms of whatever violence or language issues there were with the show that I don't know about.
Yeah, that late 90s period was an interesting time, because YTV they launched the Limbo block at that time.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, and do you remember that? I remember it being it didn't last very long. It was a really interesting attempt to try and capture the 12 to 17 audience. I'm really hoping that some videos of the promos and disclaimers and stuff surface, because man, it was a real hodgepodge of interesting marketing material.
Well, I'm trying to think way back when, so long ago. I think one of the things about YTV at that time, that when you first of all, look at the fact that we had really less competition than we do now.
Yes.
And you would look at I think our team numbers at the time were huge, more than what Much was getting at the time. Yet Much had this cool factor around it, and were able to get cooler advertising and sales around some of that stuff, yet they didn't have the ratings that YTV was having with their teen audience. So I think they tried to create something that would be more palatable to bring to advertisers, to sort of say, look, we get this number, this is the audience we get, but if we would put it into sort of a destination area and air the programs that are popular within that destination area, because Buffy was just started and was breaking out at the time, and we had a couple of other things there that worked well, and we bought some stuff from England and other things like that. and brought forth. But I don't think anyone was really prepared for it, and I don't think our audience was prepared for it, and it didn't really make sense, and I think people were just confused.
Nothing in it fit together, I remember.
Yeah.
I'm trying to bring up a list of the shows that ran. I know there was Stressed Eric, there was Lucy Sullivan is Getting Married. I always thought it was interesting that they never tried to put Gundam Wing in that block, even though it showed up around the same time. There seemed to be a lot of confusion as to how to handle Gundam Wing. It showed up in that really late.
I think the other thing about that block and YTV's CRTC conditions of license is that it wasn't as streamlined as it is now, and I should have probably prepared and looked up what the conditions of license for YTV was now. But back then, I can tell you them off by heart, was that post 6 p.m. we had to have 60% Canadian content. So within that 6-hour period from 6 p.m. to midnight, 60% of what we aired had to have been Canadian. Throughout our whole schedule, 35% of our foreign content had to come from a non-North American source.
Right. Yeah, I remember that condition. Yeah.
That was because people were worried that we'd be inundated with too much U.S. content. And I think people were worried about it more from the kid-centered point of view. So you had those sort of things working almost against us, and we had to try to find programming that would appeal to this audience and that would work, that was, affordable, because we weren't going to get the 90210s of the world, or what was really huge. I mean, I know we lucked out with Buffy. I know that was something that people were like, really? And then it ended up working, and for some reason we were still able to keep that around, because I think there was definitely pressure from other broadcasters to sort of buy that away from us.
Yes. I know YTV always seemed really defensive of that particular program, which is probably because it did well for them. They wanted to keep it.
Yeah, no, it did. So, yeah. So the shows that you mentioned buying, I mean, so Stressed Eric was a UK animated programming that, we talk about programs that don't work when we cross the border on animation. This is one that didn't cross the opposite way. There's probably a couple of other British animation ones there too. And I just don't think they thought, if Gundam Wing was there at the time, that they actually even thought it was probably what would they pair it with in the block, but they wouldn't pair everything. I remember we bought a 1-hour WB drama called Opposite Sex or something like that, which was about teens coming of age in high school, but the problem was the WB canceled it after 8 episodes. So you're like, oh, we got 8 episodes of something that, we can't really air. So, I mean, there's just a lot of things with it that, maybe at the time if they had planned more carefully and sort of thought it through, and I don't think they really did. But again, it was such a long time ago, and I was just starting out there, so I don't know what all the thoughts were into that.
But there was definitely a drive for them to target that sort of elusive 12 to 17 crowd. I've always sort of been of the belief that Bionix was one of the rare examples of a successful attempt at getting that audience, especially when you see so many others fail. It was
a success, and it was, again, this is where that 35% actually helped us, because we were seeing such, Pokemon still, I think, probably still stands as the highest rated show that YTV has ever aired.
Oh, wow.
I think there was one episode that, was, over 700,000 viewers, 2+, which is huge in Canada.
Yeah.
And it was just such an utter phenomenon that we put a lot of eggs into that basket, because it was really working for us. And so that's where the Dragon Ball Z, the Inuyashas and stuff. But as we looked at Inuyasha and Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball, they couldn't really air earlier. So we sort of created this area for them. Well, we also for them at night, but we also saw a dual audience, which was that kids were watching, but more often than not, adults were watching. So and at the same time, we were also airing the Justice League series, the first one, which I think the first year of that actually surpassed Buffy for our adult audiences. So it was like, well, why don't we create something with this type of programming, some sort of block? And I think at the beginning of it, it wasn't meant to be like a specific anime only block. It was a specific block geared towards an audience that was interested in that type of programming.
It always kind of was, but yeah. I think for a huge part of the audience, the anime was the main draw.
Oh yeah, no, totally. But we also wanted to pair stuff that worked together, like a Justice League sitting alongside an Inuyasha didn't feel as far-fetched as something else.
But it's interesting because the block was geared towards 12 to 17, and when you looked like over stuff that was airing on Cartoon Network, there was many shows. I mean, and that's the funny thing about Cartoon Network and Adult Swim is that they were always very open about their ratings information for some reason too, and still are. And many of their shows excelled in 12 to 17 ratings on both sides of the Cartoon Network Adult Swim border, both anime and other types of content. But they always routinely ignored that audience, whereas YTV really embraced it, and it seemed to be to their benefit as well.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, YTV was good at embracing. We had our tiers of who we wanted to attract, but we also knew that at some there are these little niches here and there that we could possibly build stuff and attract kind of different audiences as long as it didn't overshadow what we were doing as a whole. And so Bionix just became something where we were able to do that, and it also fulfilled again a CRTC requirement, because it was starting to become harder to find quality non-North American kids programming that worked on the same scale as our ratings did. When you were trying to follow SpongeBob and Fairly Odd Parents, it was hard to find that quality programming, and the anime certainly fulfilled that requirement.
And of course, that requirement is no longer there in their license, I believe. Yeah.
No, it is not. I mean, I don't think that requirement contributed to the demise of Bionix, like the losing of that requirement.
Yeah.
I think what contributed to the demise of Bionix was the influence and possible detriment that was having to the rest of our schedule, as well as the rise of the live action tween stuff that Disney was having.
Of course, the co-viewing strategy, because that's the thing that I think people have sort of caught on to, is that when you go all in on that live action dramedy Disney style format for your whole station, you really can't. There's no room to experiment with your Limbos and your Bionixes anymore. You kind of have to just put in something that both adults and kids are going to watch together, and that's really what kind of alienates the 12 to 17 crowd. At least that's from what I've gathered.
Yeah, and I would also add from a perspective is that it was still hard to sort of look at Much Music, which was getting the advertisers that we kind of would have wanted from Bionix, and we weren't really getting. So
they did air one anime, Beck.
Yeah, they did, didn't they?
Yeah,
and they were experimenting themselves.
Yeah, well, that was right before they were bought out by CTV too, so it was almost like a last hurrah for them. Looking at just both the Canadian media system and TV in general, I mean, do you think that the sort of systems as we have them now can still reach audiences like teens and young adults properly? Do you think there's still a lot of untapped potential there, or are people just going to sort of evade the system? Or evade television in general more and more as we move forward? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
As someone who's trying to help facilitate and create original content, I think one of the issues that we have in our country, and this is starting to be brought up now with the CRTC, I believe there's a poll going around, or whatever they're called.
Yeah, there is a CRTC survey on Canadian content, which discussed in the last episode. And if you didn't hear the last episode, definitely check out that survey. I have the link up on our social media.
Yeah. So, and I think one of the hardest things for us producing this, not kids content, but content as a whole, is that in order to facilitate the tax credit system, we still have to have our program air on a traditional broadcaster. So nowadays, that's just, I think everyone agrees it's almost kind of ludicrous when you make web series, when you, streaming shows for Crave and Show Me and Netflix and whatever have you, that we have to wait for a broadcaster to say, yes, we will pick that up and air that on our traditional linear network. And the problem is that funding of series becomes harder in Canada than it does anywhere else in the world. And I think that's one of the things that needs to sort of change in order for us to get out there and compete more with what we're seeing happening globally. I think is one of the things I think is really weird and twisted is that we are the home to some of the greatest comedians ever, because half of them go down and work in U.S. television, and we don't have our own sort of funny or die type of outlet here. And I know that CBC is doing a great job with their Punchline and doing digital service for comedy, but it just seems ludicrous that we can't fund the same sort of thing up here with the immense talent that we have. So.
And as things are right now, it seems, even when you look at our streaming platforms like Shomi and Crave, a lot of the same problems seem to be sort of seeping into that area.
Yeah, I mean, Crave just did Letterkenny, but I mean, Letterkenny was commissioned for Comedy Network, and eventually it's going to air there. So that's one way of getting around it, I suppose, in terms of how you premiere it. But you still tie a broadcaster, and I think that's one of the things that a lot of us really want to see change, just to make access to funds easier to help us start getting some of that content out there that we know that we're capable of doing. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, no, it certainly does. And so many projects have a hard time getting off the ground. Like, I'm sure you've been following that whole thing with Urbance. Have you heard of that one?
Which one?
Urbance. It's that Montreal-produced animated production. It's sort of like an anime-infused style show about that world where sex has become outlawed.
Oh, yes.
They've been trying to get that off the ground for a ludicrously long amount of time. A lot of the initial pre-production work has been floating around online for like close to 7 years now. They finally got their pilot produced, and it's a 6-minute pilot. I gave them $80, and I still haven't gotten my fucking Blu-ray yet. I'm waiting for that to come in the mail. Still, all they have to show for it is that 6-minute trailer, or that 6-minute pilot. And they claim that they have a Canadian broadcaster and some European broadcasters attached to it, but the project just can't get off the ground for some reason. It almost seems like that is the type of show that, you know, obviously a lot of people would like to see, but nobody wants to pay for. I mean, do you think, again, I guess you're familiar with it, but do you think that kind of situation can change, or do you think this is just a unique problem with this particular production? I don't know if it's a good example.
I think. One of the things, again, this goes to Canada being 10th of population as the United States. Yet we have so many people to create content and do stuff. I think there are just limited places to put it, and there are limited access, and the access to the funding is just harder. That a lot of Canadian programming has. You tend to do a lot of these fun, what I call fun, wacky, tri-country deals. Just in order to get your show made. The Orphan Black, BBC, Space, you know, trifecta. And when it works great, like Orphan Black. And when it doesn't, you're stuck with a hodgepodge of a show that's trying to appeal to different countries, because each country who puts money has a say in how they want the show to work. So, you know, and I think that, you know, if we could just change, you know, a couple of the rules, and I'm not saying the rules are bad. I think rules are needed, or guidelines are needed, but I think this idea of a traditional broadcaster or a traditional funding mechanism has to change, and that would allow for a lot more of other shows not to be so much tied to trying to find money outside or elsewhere, or figure out how we get this all to sort of work. Especially because traditional broadcasters, and this isn't just in Canada, but I mean around the world, you know, are, you know, as much as Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and Shomi and Crave and all these new services are popping up, all the other services are sort of, you know, being bought up and being merged into one thing. So now buyers and content creators are looking for shows that fit various platforms that they have that can be aired on various different services. So it's a lot harder to, you know, sometimes you're not just pitching to one specific broadcaster. I have an animated show that's this, and they're thinking, well, how does this air on all these sort of different platforms that we have? It's harder. It's easy. Someone would say it's easier now, and it's also harder. So, but if we can just change a couple of the rules with funding mechanisms, I think we could be able to open up a few more doors and have a lot more fun with it.
So you don't think we necessarily need a giant sweeping change of things? We can just there are less drastic solutions?
Yeah, I don't think we need a giant sweeping change of things, because I think once you do giant total sweeping changes of things, you tend to lose more than you gain, in my opinion. I think we just need to sort of, you know, open up the boundaries of what you know. I think the specific one is being tied to the broadcaster. So open up some of those boundaries that a broadcaster is not your traditional broadcaster, but could be a web a web presence or a streaming platform or an SVOD or an AVOD or something like that, I think, getting that one done would open up huge avenues towards us. But I think there's been so much change in the past 3, 4, 5 years that that a lot of that change has almost allowed our country to be less of an incubator for original ideas and more of a place where the U.S. and other people can come and use our tax credits, and we just end up being sort of service providers.
Yeah.
With Runaway Productions, and both in live action and animation. So on one hand, you can say that's great for an industry as a whole because we're creating jobs, but we're not actually creating, content or art. And that can be very, very detrimental.
With Inspector Bronco, I did find it really interesting their Teletoon's current kind of approach with that, with actually polling viewers on what they like and didn't like about the kind of essentially doing a mass focus group. Do you have any opinion on that? Do you think that there's more of a concern about audience expectation now than there may have been before?
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. One thing I should say in the Canadian system, and I don't know how it was done in prime time, but in my experience in the Canadian system, the idea of what they have in the U.S. of a pilot system, where you go, you pitch your idea, you create your idea, and then you make a pilot, and then your pilot is tested, and then if your pilot is picked up, then you shoot. Is not a concept here. We either make it or we don't. And focus group testing is considered a luxury. In my experience.
Oh, yeah.
In this industry. But it was always something that we kind of wish we had, because you sink a lot of money into making 13 episodes of something, and you're like, we're going with our gut. Hopefully we make or break it. And I'm not saying focus testing is the be-all, end-all, that, because you get a group of 20 people in a room and they say something's good or something's bad, that therefore, everyone else around the country is going to be excited for it. But it does sort of, at least it's someone who is outside of that small incubator of who can see it with fresh eyes, and it's nice to have that sort of feedback.
The fact that focus testing Canadian content before it goes into production is such an unusual tactic, I think, really says a lot about how this has traditionally been interpreted.
Yeah, I mean, again, I can't speak for the primetime way. I can only speak for my experience.
Yeah.
The focus group testing wasn't something that we done. It's been done a lot more now in the past 5-6 years. I know that my last 2 years of Teletoon, we did do focus group testing on certain series, and we were able to get that done. But when I was at YTV, it wasn't something we really did. The one thing about what they're doing, putting it online, is that when you open it up to the whole world like that, you also have to look at,
just Canada. It is region locked.
Well, just Canada, but you're still opening up to all the comments that people can get. And we've seen comment, and people have been to comment boards on like YouTube and whatever, on just on any video, and people can be pretty harsh and pretty out there. So I'm curious to see what kind of feedback they get and what they take from it. Because it's a lot easier on the internet to put your diatribe out there than if you're in a smaller sort of contained group.
As far as acquired content goes with animation, like for stuff like anime, is there anything that viewers can really do to try and create more of a push for that kind of stuff? Like if they want to see Teletoon air more anime, is there anything they can do, or are they just kind of at the whims of the network?
You're never at the whims of the network. I know that I looked and read everything, and as much as I could with the amount of information you're given. I think the network has so many different masters it has to do to deal with, that sometimes, while everyone is clamoring for this, it may still not just sort of be right. I think, going and writing and saying, here's some great stuff that I would like to see, and, less of the you suck, you should air this instead, or whatever, is probably where it will get dismissive.
Yeah.
But it's always good to sort of state your case and make your case as to why to air something and why we like it. And especially in this internet age, a lot of people kind of do that. People are showrunners and writers are a bit more adept to sort of react to what viewers are saying via the internet. It's up to them whether they choose to follow it or not, because sometimes it might work and sometimes it might not work. But I think now they're looking at it and sort of taking it a bit more seriously than they have in the past. So where all they relied upon was a number and an advertiser, so to speak.
All right, one more question before we finish. So, John, do you still watch TV?
Yes, I do. Yeah, no. I mean, I watch Netflix. I binge watch. I watch streaming services. I watch everything, but I still watch traditional TV, and DVR a lot of stuff. I still watch commercials. One of the things that one of the things I always say is that I wish commercials were still a bigger thing, because I got more stuff done, because during commercial breaks I could actually go and do things, and now with no commercials, it's just on the streaming services, it's like, oh my god, I've left my laundry sitting for a couple of days while I binge watch a show. I'm not a fan of binge watching, only because I could probably watch two to three episodes of something, and then all of a sudden I need to watch something else, just different, because otherwise it's just too much. I streamed for some reason. So here's a good example of where my viewing habits come. I watched Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt all the first season in one day, 13 episodes, and by like episodes 8, I just literally hated the show, because I just felt it was too wacky. I had no sense of the timing. I had no sense of how the progression was of the series in terms of, are we now 2 months later or 3 months later or anything like that? Whereas on a weekly basis, that stuff is a lot easier to sort of handle.
To be fair with that show, the first 8 or 9 episodes were actually done for NBC before and Netflix picked it up. So I think season 2 is definitely a little more tailored to the binge watch format.
But I find that with a couple of other things as well that I've sort of gone back on. But yeah, no, I still watch stuff weekly. What's big on my radar is just recently finished The Magicians, which I absolutely loved, and just finished watching on showcase.ca the show Unreal, which if you're a big reality show fan is a must-see. I would recommend. In terms of the animation side, Steven Universe I really love. Mm-hmm. I think of the future. I have hope for the future of kids cartoons based on Steven Universe, because they do such a great job with that show. And Cartoon Network should be applauded, because they set up a great incubator programming there when they did Adventure Time, using those creators and that pool of talent that they have there to help create new programming. Yeah,
it's setting up an impressive groundwork. Yeah, for sure. I hope it keeps going.
So that's kind of the sort of the stuff I watch.
Well, thanks, John. Yeah. It was great hearing your insights today.
Oh, well, thank you. Hopefully that was interesting.
And that's it for this episode. Theme song is by Ultraclystron. You can purchase it as part of his album Packet Flood at ultraclystron.com. You can reach me through Twitter @ZonanCanada or email zonancanada@gmail.com. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes or on your podcast app of choice. And as always, please recommend this show to anyone you think might be interested. See you again!